50 wide receivers. Let's go. Tier 1, you start them. We don't have to talk about them. Lamb, Chase, St. Brown, Neighbors, A.J. Brown, Drake London. If you want to scream at me until you're blue in the face that Jamar Chase should be 1 or no, Amon-Ra St. Brown should be 1, I don't care. They're in your lineup. Let's move on. Going down to tier 2, maybe this is where some of you fools have to ask some questions, but we are going to go Stephon Diggs. Obviously, with Diggs, looks to be in a much better situation post Nico Collins injury. Now that you have no Nico Collins in this offense, that's going to open up 25-30% of this Houston Texans target share for grabs. Now, obviously, we're not going to expect that Stephon Diggs grabs all of that. We're going to assume that some goes to Tank Dell, some goes to Dalton Schultz, some goes to the secondary receivers in this offense, but it does put you in a safe spot to assume that we're going to be getting 8, 9, 10 targets from one of the most efficient quarterbacks in the NFL with CJ Stroud. So I think Stephon Diggs is a top 10 wide receiver until Nico Collins comes back, which looks like maybe a considerable amount of time. Going over to our next option, Deebo Samuel will be in. Now, I understand Deebo Samuel was very disappointing last week. I'm going to be honest with you. I ranked Deebo Samuel as a must-start wide receiver last week. He gave you 3 points, and we're going right back to the well to do it again and make the same quote-unquote mistake. But what we have to remember here with Deebo Samuel is this is a receiver that's getting the artificial touches as a rusher as well with no McCaffrey in this offense. You're in an offense that currently projects out to score 25.5 points according to Las Vegas Sportsbooks. And if you actually look at the underdog pick'em that you have for Deebo Samuel, right now, Underdog Fantasy has him for higher, lower 72.5 total yards, which is actually one of the highest ranks that you have with any wide receiver this week. Now, if you wanted to say, I'm taking the lower, you do you, I'd probably warn against it, but you could find that link to Underdog Fantasy in the description and comment section. And if you want to go make that first deposit with code FLOCK, you will get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, you're going to be getting a free Brock Purdy pick, more than less than half a total yard for tonight's game. And on top of that, you'll be getting a free team review over there on flockfantasy.com. You can find that link in the description and comment section. But moving this over to our next guy, we are going to be looking at Jayden Reed. Jayden Reed was also a must-start wide receiver for us last week. And Jayden Reed was, quote-unquote, disappointing. You only had 4 receptions, 78 receiving yards. You had 13.7 fantasy points here for Reed. We talked about in the past, but he's not a receiver that's going to ever give you the 25%, 30% team target share. So it's very, very tough to imagine him ever being a tier 1 option. But until you get Christian Watson back in, where we're going to assume that Christian Watson is missing this game, he does look to be a top 10 receiver in fantasy, where right now sportsbooks are putting the Green Bay Packers as the second highest scoring offense in the NFL this week, only behind the Baltimore Ravens. And right now, Jayden Reed's underdog pick'em is higher, lower 60.5 receiving yards. Now going over to Garrett Wilson, obviously, we are going to have to monitor what the change with this coaching staff does. You still have Nathaniel Hackett here at the offensive coordinator spot, so I don't know if really a ton changes with Wilson. We are seeing that they are doing everything they can to get him the ball, almost in an artificial way. I mean, they're manufacturing targets for Garrett Wilson at this point, where right now he's at the very top of the NFL in total targets. The efficiency is definitely worse than we expected from this offense. Currently, you have an implied team total of only 19.25 points, which this is supposed to be the worst offense of any receiver inside the top 2 tiers. Our next guy will be Chris Godwin going up against the New Orleans Saints. What we have historically seen is that the Lattimore matchup is actually not great for Mike Evans, whereas it is for Chris Godwin. Obviously, over the past 2 weeks, Mike Evans has been the dominant wide receiver, but we talked about this all season now. If you look at the underlying target volume and how these wide receivers have operated in the past, really, you're going to expect this to swing one way, then the other, one way, then the other. I don't think that these receivers are that far at all in our rest of season ranks, just specifically this matchup against the New Orleans Saints, where Evans has historically struggled. Now, our next tier is going to be led off with DK Metcalf. Metcalf has, on paper, maybe a tough matchup going up against the Niners, but in reality, sportsbooks are giving the Seattle Seahawks a fine shot here. You actually have an implied team total of 22 points. So Seattle's supposed to be an above average offense this week. And what we have seen so far this season is we've actually seen that in games where the Seattle Seahawks will trail, you are going to get 50 plus pass attempts for Geno Smith. Geno Smith currently is at the very top of the NFL in total passing volume. Now, of course, with Metcalf, you're having to still contend with targets going to JSN, still contend with targets going over to Tyler Lockett. However, Metcalf is the wide receiver one in this offense. He actually played 100% of the snaps against the New York Giants this past week. And while it's maybe a tougher matchup on paper, if you look at the underlying projections, Underdog has him at 66.5 total yards. And like we said, sportsbooks have the Seattle Seahawks at an implied team total of 22 points. Deontay Johnson will be our next guy. We had the absolute collapse of this Carolina Panthers offense last week. But this week, going up against the Atlanta Falcons, sportsbooks are putting the Carolina Panthers as a team that should score about 20.5 points. So it should just be a slightly below average offense. It's not going to be a league bottom offense. And also what we saw this past week with the Atlanta Falcons is Baker Mayfield went out there, had himself one hell of a day. We had everything going through Evans. And here, I think you should expect the same thing with Deontay. Obviously, this past week, it was horrendous against the Bears, which was a much tougher matchup. But the 2 weeks prior, you actually had 27 total targets for Deontay Johnson. So over the past 3 weeks, Deontay Johnson has been averaging 11 targets a game. Now, our next guy will be Devonta Smith. With Smith going up against the Cleveland Browns, I'm expecting him to be 100% healthy. I'm expecting that we also have, A.J. Brown 100% healthy. There's a massive spread on this game against the Browns. So one thing I think you can be slightly concerned with is this Philadelphia Eagles team deciding to really run the ball in the second half. Now, Brandon Ayuk will be our next player. Ayuk was that clear must-start name for us last week. We had him about this same spot in the rankings. This week against the Seattle Seahawks, you actually have a lower implied team total here in a slightly tougher matchup. The Niners only projected out to score 25.5 points. Right now, Brandon Ayuk is at higher, lower 63.5 receiving yards with his underdog pick'em. Obviously, he's been very inconsistent so far this season. Through the first 4 weeks, Brandon Ayuk gave you a total of 0 games with over 10 fantasy points. Now, this past week, you get the blow up with the 23 fantasy points with the 12 targets. So obviously, it was a lot more exciting. Obviously, you get that glimpse that, yes, Ayuk is still the man that they gave $120 million. So I'm going to stand by him. I think he's still a must-start guy every single week. I'm going over to DJ Moore. I want to say that, maybe, just maybe, it's a spot in which we should expect that Caleb takes a step backwards. However, the thing is, the Bears right now have that implied team total of 23.5 points. It's a great matchup going up against the Jacksonville Jaguars. While I was worried about the passing volume previously in Chicago, I don't know. I mean, it makes sense that Caleb, a rookie quarterback, starts off a little bit slower. Not everybody is CJ Stroud. Not everybody is Jaden Daniels. And if we get Caleb going in the right direction, and obviously DJ Moore, the absolute blow-up game this past week, still think he's for sure a must-start player, but I mean, even higher than we had him previously. Now, obviously, we had the 105 receiving yards and the 2 receiving touchdowns. I will say it was off only 8 targets, if that makes a difference. Now, going over to Marvin Harrison Jr., obviously, this is another rookie wide receiver that's been a little bit inconsistent so far. One of my favorite underdog picks this week, actually going up against the Green Bay Packers, is to go with Harrison higher than 53.5 receiving yards. But yeah, I think if you're seeing the projections be this low, at the same time, you have an implied team total of only 22 points here for this Arizona Cardinals offense. Maybe we have to be a little hesitant to just go through and jam Marvin Harrison in, where, I mean, if you're looking at what he has done so far this year, you're really only averaging 6-7 targets a game, but we would naturally assume that the rookie continues to improve as the season goes on. Mike Evans will be our next guy here. I mean, we can just go through and do this briefly, but you can do your own research and really dive into the numbers. I'm not going to spend that much time with a single player in the top 50 of these rankings. We can for later in the week. But if we go over the past few seasons and look at specifically what Mike Evans has done here against the New Orleans Saints, we can actually see the last week he played the New Orleans Saints. You actually had 3 receptions total for 70 receiving yards. So the 10 fantasy points, not horrible, but not necessarily something that you're super excited about. The week prior, you had Chris Godwin with the blow up for 114 receiving yards, but you had the 3 receptions and 40 receiving yards for Mike Evans in that contest. And then going over to what we had in 2022, which I know obviously we were backtracking here a decent ways, but still it is worth bringing up. December 5th, here you had the blow up from Godwin. However, Mike Evans gives you the 4 receptions, 459 receiving yards. And we can keep on doing this, but the long story short is, historically speaking, Evans has struggled against the Saints. Typically, this is something that I'm willing to kind of overlook and say, oh, okay, well, the projections have Mike Evans higher, lower, 65.5 receiving yards. The Bucs have been a great offense so far this season. Mike Evans has been great this year. But when you have a sample size that's this large, maybe we give it some credit. Now, going over to our next guy, we'll be looking at Terry McLaurin. With Terry McLaurin, over the past 3 weeks, you are sitting here averaging over 15 points per game. It's the best quarterback play that he's had in his entire NFL career. And I do want to reiterate, while Jaden Daniels is by far and away the best quarterback in McLaurin's career, while Jaden Daniels looks like he is one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL right this second in terms of how he's playing now, of course, we'll see if it's going to keep up. If you actually look at the passing volume, which is what we care about for fantasy football, the Commanders are averaging fewer passing yards per game this season than they were last season. So while Daniels is great for the Commanders, limiting turnovers, giving you the rushing production, not only with rushing yards, but rushing first downs as well as rushing touchdowns, it's not like Terry McLaurin is dramatically a different player than he was in the past. If we do take a step backwards, McLaurin has been averaging, if you include the first 2 weeks, closer to about 12, 13 fantasy points per contest. Now, going over to what we have with Brian Thomas. Brian Thomas has been incredible. Back-to-back weeks here with over 20 fantasy points. And at the same time, we are going to naturally give the benefit of the doubt for the rookie receivers to continue to improve as the season goes on. Over the past 3 weeks, he's had a total of 26 targets. So not only has he been productive, but the volume has supported it as well. Now, my hesitation that we have with Brian Thomas is nothing to do with himself, but is everything to do with the matchup that you have going up against the Chicago Bears. Right now, sportsbooks are giving the Jacksonville Jaguars only an implied team total of 21 points. This is a London game where you have inherently a lot of uncertainty attached to it as well. And the Bears have been successful so far this season in limiting opposing wide receiver ones. So while Brian Thomas would be higher in these rankings most weeks, specifically this matchup in a London game, I do want to be a little more hesitant. And then T. Higgins will be our next guy. I have T. Higgins with so many underdog teams. Obviously, we had Higgins as the buy low candidate a few weeks back. I understand that maybe he looks quote unquote low down here at 21, coming off 2 performances, or really we take a step backwards and say over the past 3 weeks, he's averaged 10 targets per game. And what we projected out to be one of the best offenses in the NFL, and sportsbooks are following up with that, giving the Cincinnati Bengals an implied team total of 26.25 points. I do want to just admit that this tier, it really doesn't matter how you rank them. That's why we do this as tier list. So before you go down and go, oh my gosh, I can't believe he has Brandon Ayuk this much higher than T. Higgins. In my mind, they are about the same. If they're in the same tier, if you have your personal preference, you go with them. Obviously, Higgins has been absolutely crushing it, and Higgins should be a must-start guy, as indicated with him being inside the top 21 spots in these rankings. Now, going over to what we have with George Pickens. Obviously, we update these rankings over on flockfantasy.com literally every single day leading up till Sunday. And to be honest with you, after I made this list and after we updated the rankings on the site on Wednesday, I realized that George Pickens will be a player that we do have to move down on. While Pickens, you did get the 11 target game 2 weeks ago. And while Pickens, yes, against Denver almost had a much bigger game as well. If we do take a step backwards, you've only had 1 game so far this season with more than 7 targets. This goes back to Justin Fields being your quarterback. While Fields himself can be a decent real-life option if he's able to limit turnovers, pick up rushing first downs, rushing yards, and rushing touchdowns, that does not translate to points at the wide receiver position. This matchup going up against the Raiders is probably one where they're able to lean on the run and actually just lean a little more on Najee Harris. Obviously, Pickens was a massive letdown in a game against the Dallas Cowboys. So when we update these rankings later in the week, George Pickens will probably be falling down. He'll stay inside the same tier, but I think there are some other receivers in the tier I would prefer. Like our next guy, Zay Flowers. With Flowers, he was somebody that was very interesting to start last week if you were looking at sportsbook projections. Going up against the Bengals, most sportsbooks had the Baltimore Ravens as a team that were going to have to throw the ball a lot more. I mean, it was a high-scoring game. It was supposed to be very close. Here against the Commanders, there's a pretty large spread on this game where sportsbooks are saying that the Ravens are kind of going to blow them out of the water. But right now, if you go over to Underdog Fantasy, you actually see there's a higher lower 225.5 passing yards with Lamar Jackson. The higher lower on Derrick Henry total yards is only 92.5. And you have higher lower 57.5 total yards for Zay Flowers. So the projections right now are honestly that this is maybe, again, an offense that, of course, is going to be phenomenal, that you want as many pieces of as you can possibly get. But they may have to throw the ball a little bit if they're going to get pressure put on them from Jaden Daniels. Now, Amari Cooper will be our next guy. Amari Cooper is booty cheeks with Deshaun Watson under center. If you have Amari on your team, I'd rather not start Amari until we get a change at quarterback. Right now, you have an implied team total of 17.5 points, indicating that this is supposed to be one of the worst offenses in the NFL with some of the least efficient quarterback play in the entire NFL as well. Christian Kirk will be our next guy. A couple different things. One, if Evan Ingram does play, I'm maybe a little bit concerned that you end up getting some targets siphoned away from the receivers. But almost more importantly to point out here is going to be the fact that it's that tough matchup against the Chicago Bears, while at the same time it's the London game with the inherent uncertainty. Now, going over to Darnell Mooney. Darnell Mooney will probably be the receiver that actually rises in these rankings. Couple different things. If you look at the Underdog pick'ems right now, Underdog currently does have Darnell Mooney higher lower 53.5 total yards, which is actually a higher mark than what you have with Christian Kirk, a higher mark than what you have with Amari Cooper, what you have with George Pickens. And it makes sense because if we're looking at the implied team total, you have a total of almost 27 points going up against Carolina Panthers. Well, obviously, Kirk Cousins is not going to be having 500 passing yards again in this offense. He can scale back and you can see him literally have half this passing volume with 250, and still in today's NFL, that actually may be more than enough passing volume to support not only a top 10 receiver, but also another top 24 option. So when we update these rankings on the site, don't be surprised at all if we see Pickens fall down to about wide receiver 26 and see Mooney slide up to about wide receiver 23. But ultimately, they're in the same tier, right? So no big deal. I'm going over to our next player. We are going to be looking at Tank Dell. With Tank Dell, he is also higher than what you have with guys like Amari Cooper, George Pickens, and Christian Kirk with the Underdog pick'ems, where he's at higher lower 55.5 total yards. Obviously, we are going to assume that you get significantly more target volume going in the direction of Tank Dell with the Nico Collins injury. But with that being said, going up against the New England Patriots, this game has one of the lowest over-unders of any game in the NFL this week. Currently, the Texans are favored by about a touchdown. So I do think you are at risk for the Texans to kind of shut it down in the second half in terms of pushing the pace of play, throwing the ball with aggression, and maybe instead they play a little bit safer and you just see rush attempts because the Patriots aren't able to score. Jackson Smith-Njigba will be our next guy. I mean, with JSN, it's an offense that we've seen like 50 plus Geno Smith dropbacks a game. Geno Smith has been insane with the total passing volume that he's had. It's one of the most pass-happy offenses that we have in the NFL. Going up against the Niners, they'll probably be forced to keep that same path, especially in the second half here if they trail. Now, with that being said, you still have Tyler Lockett, you still have DK Metcalf, so it's not like a spot where JSN's going to be able to dominate and see 25 to 30% of this team's target share. He's definitely flashed. He's been a little inconsistent. Now, I will say, of course, since he plays on Thursday night, if you do decide to play Jackson Smith-Njigba, make sure you're not putting him in your flex. If you're going to be playing him, put him in at wide receiver 2 and move whoever your wide receiver 2 is down to your flex spot. Just in case we get a surprise injury late in the week, you have a little more flexibility to maneuver with your lineup. Now, Dontavian Wicks will be our next guy at 29. Now, with Wicks, this is a great matchup going up against the Arizona Cardinals. And at the same time, we are assuming that you have no Christian Watson. Now, I'm also assuming that we have Romeo Doubs back in. And I'll repeat what we said last week with Dontavian Wicks. Is he an elite talent? Probably not. Is he ever going to come out and is he ever going to dominate the target share in Green Bay? Probably not. But this is a very high volume passing attack and an offense that sportsbooks are projecting to be the second highest scoring offense in the NFL against the Arizona Cardinals. So if you don't have Christian Watson and maybe Romeo Doubs a little bit limited here, Christian Watson is definitely somebody that we want to go with. Obviously, we have to read the reports that we have with Doubs with the entire debacle that you had last week. Really hard to know exactly what to expect. Chris Olave was a receiver that burned us with our underdog picks on Monday night. And Olave is a receiver that you cannot trust with no Derek Carr. While you do have an implied team total actually of 19 points here in New Orleans, which is a little bit higher than I was expecting, I think what we probably see here with the Saints, with I believe Spencer Rattler as the quarterback, is we probably see a rush first offense that plays a little bit slower, where we're not going to see a ton of pass attempts. We're not going to see a ton of dropbacks. And Shaheed has came out and said, you know what? I'm very similar to Olave. We're not that different. So Olave, definitely not someone I want to start if we don't have to. I think he's kind of a boom bust option. Similar to what we have with some of these other boom bust options, right? I mean, looking at Jamison Williams, what's very surprising here is his higher lower on total yards on underdogs, 53.5. His higher lower just receiving yards is 46.5. But going up against the Dallas Cowboys, right now you do have the Detroit Lions projecting to be one of the highest scoring offenses in the NFL. But time and time again, we have seen what Jamison Williams is. Jamison Williams is the field stretching receiver that's not going to command a ton of target volume, that when the long touchdown's there, he is going to be great. If that long touchdown's not there, he's not really going to give you much. So definitely boom bust flex option that is interesting against the Dallas Cowboys, because how many points should be scored in this game should be one of the highest scoring games of the week. Now going over to our next guy, we're going to be looking at Calvin Ridley. This coaching staff came out and they said, yeah, we are going to get Ridley more looks. We understand that we have to blah, 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 blah. Going up against the Indianapolis Colts, honestly, you would kind of hope that Calvin Ridley is playing against Joe Flacco here. I know that sounds dumb, but if you look at the play style of this Colts offense with Anthony Richardson versus with Joe Flacco, this is a much faster paced offense where they are pushing the pace of play, running more plays per game, and should have a higher over-under in this game in general if Flacco is under center versus Anthony Richardson, at least what we saw early in the year. They were really playing extremely slow and not running a ton of plays in general, which is just going to give the Tennessee Titans a lower time of possession. So will be interesting. Obviously, it'll be interesting with Josh Downs to monitor this as well. Downs, you're going to have no Pittman. So I will be on record right now with Josh Downs. If you have Joe Flacco starting, this man is going to fly up these rankings. He could go as high as wide receiver 22 and be a must-start option with Joe Flacco. Now, I am operating under the assumption right now with these rankings that Anthony Richardson will be the guy, but obviously, I have no idea. I'm just guessing. And same thing here with Wan'Dale Robinson. I'm just guessing that Malik Nabers will be back in. Now, to be fair, this is a phenomenal matchup for Wan'Dale Robinson going up against the Cincinnati Bengals, where the Bengals have had one of the worst defenses in the NFL so far this season. Clearly, Wan'Dale Robinson has dominated in terms of targets, and Daniel Jones has been better than what you were expecting so far this year. You actually have an implied team total about 23 points here for this Giants offense. So this is a ranking under the assumption that Malik Nabers will be playing, but even with Malik Nabers playing, I think Wan'Dale will be viable. Jalen Tolbert will be our next guy here at 35. With Jalen Tolbert, you're going up against the Detroit Lions. And we know that the Lions are really going to be a pass funnel where they want to be shutting down the opposing running backs and they don't want you to run on them at all. We should get a ton of points scored in this game. If you look at the over-under, this should be one of the highest scoring games of the week, if not the highest. Jalen Tolbert plays a season high at least, and I'm pretty sure a career high, 89% of the snaps this past week. He sees a season high 10 targets. He sees a season high 7 receptions, a season high 87 receiving yards, all with no Brandon Cooks. So Jalen Tolbert looks like a very, very interesting play. Now, dropping down to our next tier, we're going to have DeAndre Hopkins at 36. Very similar to what we discussed previously with Calvin Ridley. I think you would be more excited about Hopkins if Joe Flacco is the quarterback, just because you have more points scored in the game in general with the faster pace of play. Jacoby Myers will be our next option. Very difficult to rank Myers, where we are told that Devontae Adams should be healthy and Devontae Adams should be playing this week. But at the same time, right now, you have a higher, lower 175.5 passing yards for Aiden O'Connell. So we just have no idea what this offense is going to look like with the second lowest implied team total of any team in the NFL at 16.5 points. So I don't know if Devontae Adams is going to be in. I don't really know what we can expect from the offense in general in a tough matchup against the Steelers. So I'd honestly rather avoid Myers if we can. Really, the only player I want to get in Las Vegas will be Mr. Bowers. Ladd McConkey is somebody that I have in the Flock League, and I actually may consider starting him. It's just a very tough matchup that you have going up against Denver. Based off where Ladd operates on the football field, I don't know if we're going to see a lot of Ladd Surtain combos, but just in general, Ladd McConkey is in an offense that has an implied team total of 19.25 points. Is a slow-paced offense as well. And because they're going up against the Denver Broncos, we're not expecting them to be in a position where they have to air the ball out. And instead, it's probably just going to be a low-scoring game in general. Now, our next teammates will be Keon Coleman and Khalil Shakir. Keon Coleman this season has been bad when it comes to the overall volume he's had. The fantasy points have been okay, though. Where you go through week 1, you get 9 points, 9 points in week 3, 8 points in week 4, 12 points this past week. He's doing his best Bijan Robinson impression. And obviously, you're more excited about him if Shakir does miss. Right now, the implied team total for this Bills offense is actually only 21.5 points. So sportsbooks are saying that the Bills should be worse this week than what we have seen pretty much throughout the entire year. Shaheed will be our next option. With Shaheed, I want to give the man his flowers. Back-to-back weeks here with 20 total targets. The volume's been there. He's shut me up where we were saying, oh, if you looked historically, he's a low volume, big play, boom bust option. And clearly Derek Carr loves the dude. Clearly Clint Kubiak loves the dude. Just specifically similar to what we said with Chris Olave. I don't necessarily know if you want to start any Saint here with no Derek Carr. Now, Rome Odunze will be our next option. I want to get excited about Rome, but at the same time, you've had 1 week with more than 6 targets so far this season. I really do think you have the long-term upside, but when you're averaging 5-ish targets a game, and an offense where we don't expect there to be a ton of passing volume, and an offense where you're not the wide receiver 1, I think it will be tough, but I think we'll get better as the season goes on. He's higher than this in my rest of season ranks. Now, Xavier Legette will be our next option. Looking at Legette, dealing with the shoulder injury right now, we have no idea if he will be good to go. Obviously, this is something that we're going to have to update on the site every single day until Sunday. So just make sure you check out flockfantasy.com for that. Keenan Allen will be our next option. With Keenan, he has yet to crack 7 fantasy points this year. Cortland Sutton will be our next guy. Bo Nix has been really, really bad. Finally, you get a decent game from Bo Nix last week, and that leads to 32 receiving yards for Sutton. Michael Wilson going up against the Packers. Michael Wilson has a season high 78 receiving yards this past week, but still I think you assume that we get a bounce back from Harrison. Romeo Doubs, maybe the squeaky wheel gets a little bit of grease here, but at the same time, Doubs is yet to hit 10 fantasy points in a game. Quentin Johnston, super tough matchup in a low-scoring game environment against the Broncos. And then Jerry Jeudy in what projects out to be one of the lowest scoring offenses in the NFL with slightly more target competition now that David Njoku is in. But I think that's all I got for you. I really hope I was able to help you out with this. And of course, if you wanted to check out any of those pick'ems that we talked about, you can do so over there on Underdog Fantasy. You can find that link in the description as well as the comment section. And if you use promo code FLOCK, you will get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. You'll get that free Brock Purdy pick, more than less than half a total yard for Thursday's game. And on top of that, you're going to be getting a free team review over there on flockfantasy.com. Just make sure that you set up an account on flockfantasy.com with the same email address as your account on Underdog Fantasy. That way we're able to credit you with that free team review voucher. But thank you again. Really do appreciate you and really hope I get to see you out in the live stream later tonight.